In this video, we're going to cover handling an undesirable motion. Sometimes in parliamentary law, a motion will arise that a member or a group of members strongly opposes. Often members will ask me what they can do about such a motion. The answer is that you have many options in parliamentary law for doing away with a motion that you don't like. And in case the first option doesn't work, many of these options can properly be used one right after another until one finally does work. So we're going to look at many of the tools that are available to members to deal with a motion that they don't like. Before we move forward though, I want to make it perfectly clear that all of these tools rely on the will of the majority. If you're in the minority, some of these tools will help you to convince the majority of your views, but in all cases you will need the consent of the majority. These are not parliamentary tricks to thwart the will of the majority. Such tricks would not be proper and therefore would not be parliamentary. The fact is, to adopt a motion, you have only one method. The Assembly must agree to adopt the motion, either by unanimous consent or by an actual vote. On the other hand, if you're opposed to a certain motion, you have many tools to employ to prevent its adoption. Let's say the motion we're determined to stifle is that the interior walls of the association's office building shall be painted pink. Before we get into the specific parliamentary tools that can be used to prevent this motion from being adopted, let's start by looking at some options that are available before the meeting even begins. First, if it is known in advance that this motion will be made, a member or several members could cordially contact the proponent or proponents of this motion and enter into a friendly dialogue aimed at reaching some common ground on the matter in advance of the meeting. Whether or not this strategy should be used will depend on the relationship between the proponents and the opponents. If these parties are not on good terms, such communication will do little good. But if these parties have cordial, open lines of communication, they may be able to reach a mutually acceptable compromise to the benefit of everyone involved. In other words, it doesn't hurt to pick up the phone, draft an email, or drop in for a friendly visit to discuss your concerns, if you can do so amicably. I'm definitely not recommending entering into a heated argument, which is likely to do no good. But I have seen many matters settled amicably outside of a meeting, which is a win for everyone involved. For example, the main proponents of the motion may agree to modify the proposal, accept a different proposal, or drop the matter altogether. The next option you have before the meeting begins is to rally members to vote against the motion. You can contact fellow members with whom you have a good relationship and make sure they're aware of the motion that is expected to come before the Assembly. You can ask their thoughts on the motion and share your thoughts with them. In this way, you may be able to generate the number of votes needed to defeat the motion when it does come before the Assembly, so that you can go into the meeting more confident that it won't be adopted. Okay, now that we've perused the diplomatic options, let's look at the parliamentary tools that can be used inside of a meeting to deal with an undesirable motion. We are going to be reviewing 6 motions that can be used to prevent the adoption of an undesirable motion and 1 motion that should not be used for such a purpose. Plus, we will at least mention 3 motions that may be used to assist the Assembly in dealing with an undesirable matter, but that are a bit too advanced to go into in this video. Therefore, those particular motions we will discuss in another video. So let's dive into the first of these 6 motions that we will be covering. This motion is called Objection to the Consideration of a Question. When a member makes the main motion, that the interior walls of the association's office building shall be painted pink, another member can immediately make a motion called Objection to the Consideration of a Question by saying, "Madam Chairman, I object to the consideration of the question." The member does this without being recognized by the chair and without hesitation. If the member hesitates long enough for debate to begin on the motion, it will be too late to object to the consideration of the motion, since consideration will have already begun. So, why does this motion contain the word question? Well, in parliamentary law, a motion is called a question because a motion presents a yes or no question for the Assembly to decide by vote. But what if you want to prevent such a vote from even happening? Well, that's the purpose of this first tool we're reviewing. The motion Objection to the Consideration of a Question allows a member to propose that the question not even be considered by the Assembly. This is definitely a first strike motion because it's only in order before consideration of the main question has begun. So once a member objects to the consideration, the chair says, The consideration of the question is objected to. And since this is not debatable, the chair puts it to an immediate vote by saying, "Shall the question be considered?" A two-thirds vote in the negative is required to prevent the main question from being considered. If this vote is achieved, the chair says, there are two-thirds opposed, and the question will not be considered. On the other hand, if the vote is not achieved, the chair says, there are less than two-thirds opposed, and the objection is not sustained. In this case, the Assembly proceeds with the consideration of the main question, and it is no longer in order to object to its consideration, since the Assembly has already decided that it wishes to have it considered. One more thing that needs to be understood about the motion objection to the consideration of a question is that it can only be applied to an original main motion. It cannot be applied to secondary motions or an incidental main motion. So let's say the objection to the consideration is not sustained, and so the undesirable motion continues forward. The next tool we have is a motion to postpone indefinitely. It too is applied to the main question, but unlike the first tool we covered, this motion can only be made by the member who has the floor. So a member must first be recognized by the chair before making the motion. This motion requires a second, is debatable, and requires a majority vote to adopt. If the motion to postpone indefinitely is adopted, it kills the main question for the remainder of the current session. On the other hand, if the motion to postpone indefinitely is lost, nothing happens to the main question. It is neither adopted nor lost. It simply continues to be considered. So the opponents of the main question are risking nothing by moving to postpone indefinitely, but they stand to achieve their goal of killing the main question. The motion to postpone indefinitely also has the unusual characteristic that while speaking in debate on it, a member may also speak directly to the merits of the main question. So this gives the opponents of the main question additional opportunities to speak against it. The next tool to use is the motion to amend. While the main question is pending, any member may propose an amendment to the wording. This allows members an opportunity to attempt to shape the main question into something more palatable, something they would be willing to adopt. For example, a member could obtain the floor and say, "I move to amend by striking out pink and inserting tan." This motion requires a second, is debatable, and requires a majority vote to adopt. By using the motion to amend, the Assembly has the ability to perfect the wording of the main question to arrive at language that may reflect the will of a greater number of members. If this doesn't work, the next tool to use is the motion to commit or refer to a committee. This does not represent a rejection of the main question, but it does delay its going to a vote. If a motion to refer the main question to a committee is adopted, the main question goes to the committee where it will be reviewed and reported back to the Assembly, usually at a later session and usually with recommendations proposed by the committee. This way, the Assembly benefits from the committee's research and investigation before making a final decision on the matter. If a decision seems hasty, it can be easy to convince an Assembly to delay the matter by referring it to a committee. In doing so, the issue is not halted, since the committee members will continue to work on it between meetings of the Assembly. The motion to commit or refer to a committee requires a second, is debatable, and requires a majority vote. The next tool we'll look at is the motion to postpone to a certain time, also known as postpone definitely. Unlike the motion to postpone indefinitely, which we reviewed earlier, this motion does not kill the main question. It actually sets a time at which the main question will come back before the Assembly. This motion requires a second, is debatable, and requires a majority vote, unless it makes the main question a special order, in which case it requires a two-thirds vote. We'll cover this in more detail in the video on the motion to postpone to a certain time. Another option that you have in a meeting is that you can request that the maker of the motion withdraw the motion. Now, at first, this can sound a bit absurd. Why would the maker suddenly agree to withdraw the motion? However, this does happen quite frequently in meetings, but usually only under two circumstances. One case is when new information is introduced that serves to change the mind of the maker of the motion. Another case is when debate against the motion changes the mind of the maker. When a motion is withdrawn, it's as though the motion never existed, so there's nothing further that needs to be done with the motion since there's no motion to do anything with. Whether the maker can withdraw the motion of his own accord or whether permission of the Assembly is required to allow the withdrawal depends on whether the motion has been placed before the Assembly or not. If it has not been placed before the assembly for consideration yet, the maker can withdraw it. Once it has been placed before the assembly, it belongs to the assembly, and the maker must receive the permission of the assembly to withdraw it, and granting such permission requires a majority vote. The details of withdrawing a motion will be covered in a separate video. Now, a motion that should not be used for the purpose of doing away with an undesirable main question is the motion to lay on the table, which is sometimes referred to as tabling. Quite frequently, members will move to table a motion that they don't like in order to get rid of it. This is an improper use of the motion to lay on the table. As we have seen in this video, there is an extensive list of motions that can be used to handle an undesirable motion, but lay on the table is not one of them. So it should be avoided for this purpose. In another video, we will cover the proper uses of the motion lay on the table. So, returning to the list of tools, we see that they could all be used one at a time, and if one of them succeeds, then the main question is either changed or gone, at least gone temporarily. But what if all of them fail? Well, the main question still hasn't been adopted. It will need to go to a vote before adoption, and at that point there are two more tools you can use, the two most essential tools in parliamentary law. First, you can speak against the motion in debate, encouraging other members to vote with you in opposing the motion. And finally, if all else fails, you can use the most essential and most important parliamentary tool of all. You can express your opinion through your vote, and simply vote against the motion. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned some more advanced ways of dealing with an undesirable motion. These have to do with handling a motion that has already been adopted. They are reconsider, reconsider and enter on the minutes, rescind and amend something previously adopted. We will cover these motions in detail in another video. And as an added bonus, let's look at another parliamentary tool that can, in some circumstances, prevent an undesirable motion from being adopted. That is a ballot vote. Sometimes in a meeting, members are not comfortable showing their true feelings about a motion, and members may feel pressured into voting one way or another. So what they're actually thinking may not be reflected in their votes. In these situations, members can find the freedom to vote their true conscience without feeling any of that outside pressure, simply by voting by ballot. Any member can move that the vote be taken by ballot, which requires a second and is not debatable. And it requires a majority vote to order that a vote be taken by ballot. Now, I mentioned many motions in this video, but we didn't have time to go into detail on each one of them. If you'd like to learn more about what these motions can do and how they can be applied, I encourage you to search our site for additional content and additional videos covering this material. That covers handling an undesirable motion.